Walk into a restaurant in modern New Delhi, a street food stall in Bangkok, or a bustling hot pot joint in Chengdu. The defining characteristic, the absolute foundational soul of these cuisines, is the blistering capsaicin-driven heat of the chili pepper. It feels ancient, deeply rooted in the soil and history of these regions. Today, roughly a quarter of the global population consumes chili peppers every single day. India stands as the world's largest producer and consumer of the crop, integrating it so thoroughly into its daily diet that the chili seems as indigenous as the Ganges. Thai bird's-eye chilies are globally recognized symbols of intense culinary fire, while the red-stained broths of southwestern China are fiercely defended as untouchable cultural heritage. The heat is so deeply embedded in these regional identities that imagining them without it feels like a fundamental historical error. But there is a massive historical blind spot sitting right in the middle of our plates. If you walked into a tavern in 15th century India, Thailand, or China and ordered their spiciest dish, what exactly would you be eating? You would be eating a dish flavored strictly with black and long pepper, completely devoid of chili heat. Your meal might feature heavy doses of sharp ginger, pungent raw garlic, crushed mustard seeds, or the numbing citrus tingle of Sichuan peppercorns. But the sharp, unmistakable, sweat-inducing burn of capsaicin simply did not exist anywhere in Afro-Eurasia. Before the year 1492, the chili pepper was completely unknown to the rest of the world. For millions of years, the capsicum genus was biologically locked behind the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Wild chili peppers originated as small, red, berry-like fruits in lowland South America, likely in the regions of modern Brazil. Birds, which lacked the specific pain receptors triggered by capsaicin, ate the fruits and scattered the seeds northward into Central America and Mexico. It was there, in the lowland regions of Mesoamerica, likely near the Yucatan Peninsula and southern coastal Guerrero, that humans first domesticated the plant. Archaeobotanical evidence shows that ancient Mesoamericans were consuming and cultivating chilies thousands of years ago, with some excavations uncovering remnants dating back roughly 9,000 years. For millennia, the chili pepper was a localized Mesoamerican and Andean staple. It was a crucial source of vitamins and flavor for the Maya, the Aztecs, and older regional cultures, yet it remained completely isolated from the sprawling, highly developed trade networks of the Old World. Meanwhile, the Old World had its own desperate obsession with spice, and it was entirely built around a different botanical family, the Piperaceae. The heat of Eurasian cuisines relied heavily on Piper nigrum, the familiar black pepper native to the Malabar coast of India, alongside its close relative, Piper longum, or long pepper. Long pepper in particular was prized for delivering a sharper, more complex heat than regular black pepper, and it was a staple in both Indian cooking and high-end European gastronomy. But these spices were not just flavorings used to season roasted meats or stews. They were the ultimate geopolitical leverage of the medieval world. By the late Middle Ages, the flow of black and long pepper from the Indian subcontinent to the markets of Europe was controlled by a highly rigid, fiercely protected supply chain. Arab and Indian merchants moved the spice across the Indian Ocean, funneling it into the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. From those ports, it traveled overland via caravans to the Mediterranean coast. There, the Republic of Venice held a virtual monopoly on its distribution into Europe. This chokehold meant that by the time a sack of Indian black pepper reached a European market, its price had been marked up exponentially, passing through the hands of half a dozen middlemen who each took their cut. They accumulated massive wealth, built fleets, and funded entire empires simply by controlling the transit of a small, wrinkled blackberry. This economic reality defined the geopolitical landscape of the 15th century. European monarchs were bleeding their treasuries dry, sending massive amounts of silver eastward just to pay for these spices. The desperation to bypass the Venetian Arab monopoly and secure direct access to the spice markets of India was the primary driver of the Age of Discovery. Nations were willing to risk entire armadas, bankrupt their economies, and sail into the terrifying unknown just to get their hands on the heat that Indian and Southeast Asian cooks used every day. The eventual collision of these two disconnected worlds, the biological isolation of the American capsicum and the economic desperation of the European spice market, created a shockwave that went far beyond cooking. The introduction of the chili pepper to Eurasia was not a gentle process of culinary evolution, nor was it a polite exchange of agricultural knowledge. It was a hostile takeover. A localized Central American fruit was pulled from its ancient habitat and weaponized as an instrument of global trade, rapidly hijacking the agricultural and cultural foundations of societies thousands of miles away. The modern ubiquity of the chili in Asian cuisines is often celebrated as a triumph of global fusion. But that romantic view obscures the ruthless economic mechanics that actually drove its spread. The chili did not conquer the world simply because it tasted better than black pepper. It conquered the world because it was the perfect good for open trade. Unlike black pepper, which required specific tropical climates and took years to mature, the chili was a hardy weed that could grow in almost any soil in a matter of months. It bypassed the elite merchant classes, the heavily armed trade galleons, and the fortified ports, going straight into the soil of the common farmer. It democratized heat, collapsing the very monopolies that European explorers had originally set out to capture. The irony is that the men who first brought this fruit across the Atlantic had no idea what they were actually holding. The misnaming of this plant ended up permanently reshaping the very core of half the globe. When Christopher Columbus navigated his battered ships back into Spanish waters in the spring of 1493, he was a man operating under crushing pressure. He had secured funding from the Spanish crown on a specific promise to find a direct western sea route to the riches of Asia. More importantly, he was expected to break the Venetian and Arab stranglehold on the black pepper trade. In the 15th century, Piper nigrum functioned as far more than a culinary afterthought. It was the geopolitical center of gravity. It was a hard currency, a preserver of wealth, and the primary economic engine driving European maritime exploration. Instead, he returned from the Caribbean with a handful of gold, some captive indigenous people, and a strange, fiery fruit. When Columbus and his crew first encountered indigenous communities in the Caribbean, they noticed the locals heavily seasoning their food with a native plant. Early Spanish descriptions noted that this pungency helped people cope with the cold in mountainous regions, framing the plant's effects entirely through the European understanding of spices. When the Spanish bit into a capsicum pod, they experienced a sharp burning sensation that instantly reminded them of the costly Asian spice they had sailed across the ocean to find. They did not see a new botanical family. They saw a financial loophole. Early post-Columbian sources quickly applied the Spanish term pimienta, meaning pepper, to these new fruits. By the mid-1490s, the first chili seeds and dried pods were taking root in European soil. This successful cultivation, however, marked one of the greatest strategic miscalculations in the history of global trade. The Spanish crown looked at the chili and completely missed its geopolitical value. Obsessed with securing a high-value luxury monopoly that could be heavily taxed and centrally controlled, the crown viewed the capsicum primarily as a low-status substitute for the real thing. In fact, for centuries to come, the chili pepper would remain relatively marginal in much of Western and Central Europe. While there would be notable, much later exceptions, such as the deep integration of capsicum into the paprika traditions of Hungary and parts of the Balkans, the immediate European reaction was lukewarm. The elite palates of the continent were accustomed to the prestige of imported Asian spices. A plant that could be grown in a peasant's backyard simply did not carry the social currency of a spice transported across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. The Columbian Exchange was about to transform the chili from a regionally domesticated American crop into a global commodity. But its true value would ultimately derive from its explosive adoption by non-European populations, not from elite European taste. Spain failed to realize that the true power of the chili was precisely its inability to be controlled. By treating the chili as a mere curiosity and a poor man's substitute, Spain left the door wide open. It would take a different empire, operating with a completely different maritime strategy, to look at this cheap, fiery weed and recognize it for what it truly was: an instrument of mass economic disruption. Portugal, unlike Spain, was not initially distracted by the allure of vast inland empires or mountains of silver. The Portuguese strategy was strictly, ruthlessly maritime. They were constructing the Estado da India, a sprawling and aggressive network of fortified coastal trading posts, known as feitorias, stretching from the Azores down the western coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and straight into the heart of the Indian Ocean. They were not trying to conquer continents, they were trying to monopolize the ocean's toll booths. And to keep this unprecedented, globe-spanning logistical machine running across thousands of miles of hostile water, they needed highly efficient supplies. This geopolitical framework explains why the biological trajectory of the chili pepper suddenly accelerated to a speed that defies historical logic. Within a mere 50 years, the chili had completed its sprint from the Caribbean to the western coast of India. In the context of 16th century agriculture, where crops typically migrated at the sluggish speed of overland foot traffic or localized coastal bartering, this is a biological blink of an eye. A 50-year global sprint across 3 continents is not a natural migration pattern. It is an intentional, heavily subsidized deployment. Spain discovered the chili, but Portugal weaponized it. Why did Portuguese sailors spread this specific plant faster than any other crop in human history? It was the perfect good for open exchange, cheap, addictive, and essential for provisioning ships. Life on an outward-bound Portuguese nau or carrack was a grueling test of human endurance. Voyages lasted for months without sight of land. Fresh water turned foul in wooden casks. Salted beef and pork putrefied in the damp, suffocating heat of the lower decks, and hardtack became infested with weevils. The chili pepper was an absolute revelation for maritime logistics. When dried, the pods weighed practically nothing and occupied minimal space in the crowded cargo holds. They did not spoil, rot, or attract pests. More importantly, when crushed and mixed into the daily rations, the intense capsaicin heat masked the rancid taste of decaying food, making the otherwise inedible provisions suddenly tolerable. The chili was not a luxury item. It was a baseline survival mechanism that kept crews functioning. This dynamic created one of the most profound geopolitical ironies of the Age of Discovery. The Portuguese crown was bankrupting its treasury to build armadas capable of seizing control of the Indian Ocean. They were bombarding coastal cities, sinking rival merchant fleets, and building massive stone fortresses in Goa, Cochin, and eventually Malacca for one primary reason: to corner the market on Piper nigrum, the traditional Old World black pepper. Yet, in the very holds of the warships fighting to secure this elite monopoly, the sailors were carrying the American chili. Black pepper was the grand imperial objective. The chili was the cheap operational lubricant. To understand the scale of this disruption, you have to look at the cartel the Portuguese were trying to break. For centuries, the global spice trade had been a rigid, highly centralized chokehold. Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt controlled the primary arteries of supply. Arab and Gujarati merchants moved black pepper from the Malabar coast of India across the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea. From there, it was carried overland to Alexandria, where Venetian galleys waited to distribute it across Europe. Every single hand that touched the peppercorn along this route extracted a tax, a tariff, or a markup. By the time black pepper reached the markets of Northern Europe, its price could be inflated by thousands of %. It was an incredibly fragile supply chain, artificially restricted by military force to keep prices astronomical. Portugal bypassed this cartel geographically by discovering the sea route around Africa, but they bypassed the very concept of the cartel biologically by introducing the chili. When Portuguese merchants dropped anchor at their outposts in Elmina on the Gold Coast, Luanda in Angola, or Mozambique Island, they used the chili as a low-level currency. They traded handfuls of seeds for fresh water, local produce, or minor favors from coastal chiefs. They planted it in the dirt outside their fort walls to sustain the garrisons, and unlike the fragile black pepper vine, which required specific tropical canopies, precise humidity, and years to mature before yielding a single berry, the chili was aggressively adaptable. It thrived in the harsh African sun. It produced a vibrant, fiery crop in a matter of months. Because it was so easy to cultivate, the plant could not be contained within the walls of the Portuguese feitorias. It immediately escaped into the local agricultural networks. African farmers realized that this foreign plant provided a sharp, stimulating heat that enlivened their diets, and it required absolutely no reliance on foreign merchants once the first seeds were sown. This same viral infiltration occurred when the Portuguese finally reached the Malabar coast of India. They arrived with heavily armed galleons seeking to dominate the black pepper trade, but they paid for everyday local services, labor, and supplies using the chili. The plant spread from the colonial enclaves of Goa and Cochin into the Indian interior with astonishing speed. When Portugal seized Goa in 1510, the fortified island became an accidental botanical sorting station for Asia. Portuguese vessels arriving from Lisbon via Brazil carried shipboard provisions that included dried American red peppers. In the markets of Goa, these unfamiliar pods were initially labeled Pimiento da Pernambuco, referencing the Brazilian region where sailors harvested their supplies. Yet the plant refused to remain a colonial import. By the mid-16th century, European observers recorded several distinct varieties of capsicum flourishing in the region. The Indian subcontinent was already the global capital of heat. For millennia, Indian kitchens and Ayurvedic apothecaries relied on a sophisticated triad of sharp flavors: raw ginger, the celebrated black pepper vine, Piper nigrum, and long pepper, Piper longum, known locally as Pipali. Long pepper was the everyday workhorse of Indian pungency. With its elongated pine cone-like catkins, Pipali delivered a complex, earthy, sweet, spicy burn that defined regional broths, lentil dishes, and medicinal tonics from the southern coast to the northern plains. How did a foreign fruit completely overhaul the culinary and economic foundations of the Indian subcontinent in just a few decades? The answer lies not in a sudden shift of taste, but in a brilliant bottom-up economic calculus. Locals realized they could sell their expensive native black pepper to desperate Europeans for solid silver, while substituting the heat in their own daily diets with the cheap, easily grown American chili. In the early 16th century, Piper nigrum was an international currency, a geopolitical lever, and the primary reason European galleons risked the Cape of Good Hope. Yet true black pepper was ecologically stubborn. It was chained to the wet tropical microclimates of the Malabar coast, requiring forest shade, precise monsoons, and years of vine cultivation before a harvest. Because global supply was biologically constrained and Europe's appetite insatiable, peppercorns in ports like Cochin and Calicut commanded immense premiums. European merchants arrived with ship holds devoid of goods Indian kingdoms actually needed, forcing them to pay in raw bullion. Every basket of native black pepper exported to Lisbon represented a direct influx of silver into the regional economy. This export demand created a stark economic reality at home. The American capsicum possessed none of black pepper's fragility. It did not require the shaded rainforest canopies of Kerala. It grew in arid plains, in coastal scrub, in backyard gardens, and in discarded clay pots. It survived droughts, ignored monsoons, and produced a profusion of bright red pods within months of planting a single seed. Where black pepper was a capital-intensive plantation crop, the chili was a democratic, weed-like powerhouse anyone could cultivate for free. As capsicum flooded local markets, it triggered a silent casualty in India's agricultural hierarchy: long pepper. While black pepper was protected by its astronomical export value to Europe, Pipali enjoyed no such international shield. It was primarily a domestic spice, yet remained far more labor-intensive to grow than the newly arrived American plant. Cooks discovered that drying and crushing red capsicum pods yielded a sharper, more immediate heat that easily mimicked the traditional kick of Pipali at a fraction of the cost. Within a few generations, long pepper vanished from everyday cooking, retreating into the specialized realm of Ayurvedic medicine. This agricultural substitution reshaped the economics of daily survival across the subcontinent. By replacing labor-intensive indigenous peppers with the prolific American fruit, the cost of making food palatable and microbiologically safer plummeted. Street vendors in bustling port cities and roadside inns along trade routes could now heavily season their dishes without eroding their profit margins. The Columbian Exchange delivered the plant to coastal enclaves like Goa and Cochin, but indigenous networks propelled the chili across the interior. Arabian and Gujarati merchants trading along the western seaboard carried baskets of dried pods to northern ports. Regional armies acting as unwitting seed dispersers further accelerated the migration, as Maratha military campaigns expanded across the Deccan Plateau toward the Gangetic Plains. Their supply trains carried hardy, non-perishable peppers as an essential ration. The chili traveled along ancient river systems and trade highways, adapting so rapidly to local soils that distinct regional varieties evolved within decades of their first planting. The speed and completeness of this culinary takeover produced a remarkable phenomenon in agricultural history: total botanical amnesia. Because the plant integrated seamlessly into existing preferences for pungency, and because it was cultivated in virtually every village from Maharashtra to Bengal, by the 18th century, the chili was universally regarded as an ancient indigenous Indian birthright. Even professional European botanists conducting surveys in the early modern period were deceived by its saturation, formally cataloging capsicum varieties as species native to India or Indochina. While Portugal spent the first half of the 16th century aggressively pushing east across the Indian Ocean, Spain was still looking for a western backdoor to the spice markets. The Spanish crown had never abandoned the original objective that sent Columbus across the Atlantic. They desperately needed a direct route to Asia, one that completely bypassed the Portuguese-controlled Cape of Good Hope and the entrenched middlemen of the Middle East. This geographic imperative set the stage for a monumental geopolitical convergence. Where did their rival trade empires and their respective peppers finally collide? The answer materialized in the Philippines in 1565, creating a secondary biological explosion across Southeast Asia. That year, an expedition led by Miguel López de Legazpi departed from New Spain, modern-day Mexico, and crossed the vast expanse of the Pacific to establish a permanent settlement in Cebu, eventually moving the capital to Manila. This effectively integrated the Philippine archipelago into the Spanish East Indies and forged the final link in a truly global supply chain. For the next 2.5 centuries, the Philippines was governed not from Madrid, but directly from Mexico City. To maintain this immense trans-Pacific lifeline, Spain established the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. These galleons were massive, heavily armed vessels designed to move thousands of tons of Mexican and Peruvian silver to Asia, exchanging it for Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices to bring back to the Americas. But they also functioned as an unprecedented biological conveyor belt. The Pacific crossing was a brutal, months-long ordeal, and the ships had to be heavily provisioned with durable American crops. Along with maize, tomatoes, and sweet potatoes, the galleons carried vast quantities of dried Mexican chilies. Scholarly analysis confirms that chili peppers first reached the Philippines in the late 16th century aboard these specific ships. This Pacific crossing meant that the chili pepper had now successfully circled the globe. Spain and Portugal were bitterly contesting the nearby Maluku Islands, the fabled Spice Islands, willing to wage war over the rights to cloves and nutmeg. Yet entirely by accident, they were simultaneously flooding the region with a Mesoamerican weed that would ultimately touch more lives than any luxury spice they sought to control. Once the chili arrived in regional hubs like Manila and the Portuguese-held port of Malacca, local Asian trade networks immediately took over. Chinese merchant junks operating a lucrative arbitrage network between the Philippines, Indonesia, and the mainland picked up the seeds. Local seafaring traders moved the hardy pods from port to port along the coasts of the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. The impact of this secondary biological flood is most visible in the radical transformation of Thai cuisine. Before the arrival of European ships, the culinary traditions of the Ayutthaya Kingdom and the broader Southeast Asian mainland were highly aromatic and pungent, but they were not chili hot. Cooks relied on the slow, earthy warmth of native long pepper, the sharp bite of local ginger, and the aromatic intensity of black pepper. These ingredients provided a dense, building heat, but they completely lacked the volatile, immediate chemical burn of capsaicin. When the chili infiltrated the regional ports, introduced to the Thai mainland either by Portuguese envoys or intermediate Asian merchants by the late 16th or early 17th century, it encountered a culinary culture already primed for intense flavors. The adoption was rapid and absolute. The American chili offered a level of sheer botanical intensity that native peppers simply could not match. Furthermore, just as it had in India, the chili thrived in the local climate. It did not require the highly specific monsoon-drenched agroecological zones needed to cultivate fragile black pepper vines. It could be grown effortlessly in high humidity and poor soil, providing a cheap, easily accessible source of heat. Over the following centuries, specific varieties of the plant, most notably the fierce, tiny bird's-eye chili, became structurally embedded in the regional diet. The fruit ceased to be an exotic import and became a defining component of Thai curries, stir-fries, and complex chili pastes. It replaced the expensive, labor-intensive long pepper, democratizing pungency for the poorest farmers. Modern culinary historians and chefs note that the chili provides a specific brightness and energy that fundamentally balances the sour, sweet, and salty profiles of modern Southeast Asian food. Today, the chili pepper is regarded as a core pillar of Thai flavor, as non-negotiable and historically entrenched as fish sauce or lemongrass. The Galleons provided the initial transport, but the sheer agricultural efficiency of the plant executed the conquest. While the Spanish galleons were flooding Southeast Asia, the Portuguese maritime network had already pushed further north, making sustained contact with Ming Dynasty China by 1542. They established footholds along the southeastern coast, bringing the American chili to the trading hubs of Zhejiang and Guangdong. But the sheer scale of the Chinese landmass meant that maritime trade was only one vector of transmission. Seeds moved overland from India, crossing the Himalayas and filtering through the ancient southwestern trade routes via Burma into Yunnan province, while other varieties trickled down the remnants of the Silk Road into the northwestern frontiers. This dual entry, by sea and by land, set the stage for a massive agricultural infiltration. Yet the initial reaction in China mirrored the early Spanish indifference. In the prosperous cosmopolitan coastal provinces of the southeast, the chili was largely ignored as a food source. The coastal elites had access to abundant sea salt, refined sugar, and a steady supply of traditional spices. To a wealthy merchant in Guangzhou or a scholar in Suzhou, the aggressive heat of the capsicum was unrefined, a crude botanical novelty suited only for ornamental gardens. For decades, the plant languished on the coastal fringes of the Ming Empire, categorized in local agricultural gazetteers merely as a foreign pepper or barbarian pepper with visually striking red fruit. The chili reached China by sea, but it conquered the empire by land. Why did the poorest, most geographically isolated inland provinces embrace it the most? The answer lies in the brutal economic realities of peasant survival. As the plant moved away from the wealthy coast and followed the river systems into the rugged, mountainous interior during the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, it encountered a vastly different demographic. In landlocked mountainous regions like Guizhou, Hunan, and Sichuan, basic survival was dictated by access to essential commodities. Chief among these was salt. In imperial China, salt was a strictly controlled government monopoly and a primary source of state revenue. Transporting heavy loads of salt from the coastal evaporation pans or distant brine wells into the isolated southwestern mountains was a logistical nightmare. The cargo had to be hauled by human trackers up the treacherous gorges of the Yangtze River or carried on foot over steep mountain passes, heavily taxed at every provincial border. For the peasant class, hacking agricultural terraces out of the hillsides of Guizhou, this made salt prohibitively expensive, often entirely out of reach. The inland poor faced a daily diet of bland, coarse grains like sorghum, millet, and low-quality rice, and boiled vegetables completely devoid of seasoning. The American weed offered a biological loophole. Capsaicin triggers the body's pain receptors, simulating a physical intensity that tricks the palate into accepting otherwise unpalatable food. Furthermore, the intense heat stimulates salivation and gastric juices, physically aiding the digestion of tough, fibrous peasant rations. The chili served as a desperate, highly efficient substitute for salt. The plant's ability to thrive in poor soil allowed peasants to bypass imperial spice monopolies. Beyond the economics of the salt monopoly, the chili solved a pressing environmental problem. The geography of the Yangtze River Basin, particularly the Sichuan Basin and the river valleys of Hunan, is characterized by brutal, stagnant humidity. In the framework of traditional Chinese medicine, this damp, fog-choked climate causes internal dampness and cold to accumulate in the body, leading to lethargy, joint pain, and disease. The medical consensus required foods that could expel this internal dampness. The aggressive, sweat-inducing heat of the chili perfectly fit this medical requirement. It became a daily medical necessity for laborers and farmers working waist-deep in the damp paddy fields. This agricultural and medical adoption was accelerated by massive demographic shifts. The transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty in the 17th century involved catastrophic wars, famine, and plague that severely depopulated the Sichuan Basin. In response, the Qing government initiated one of the largest internal migrations in human history, encouraging millions of peasants from Hunan, Hubei, and Guangdong to reclaim the empty land, a movement known as Huguangtian Sichuan. These migrants carried the chili pepper with them. As they cleared forests and rebuilt the agricultural infrastructure of the basin under harsh frontier conditions, the chili was their primary seasoning. A cheap, non-perishable survival ration that could be dried and stored for the harsh winters. By the 18th and 19th centuries, what had begun as a cheap salt substitute for desperate migrants had evolved into the defining structural element of inland Chinese cuisine. The foreign chili merged seamlessly with indigenous ingredients. In Sichuan, the sharp, fiery heat of the American capsicum was paired with the numbing, citrus-like tingle of the native Sichuan peppercorn. This combination created the signature mala, numbing and spicy flavor profile that defines the region today. The plant became so deeply entrenched in the daily lives of the inland population that it transformed into a fierce marker of regional identity. The ability to consume intense chili heat became a point of cultural pride, a badge of toughness and endurance for the people of Hunan and Sichuan. The coastal elites had rejected it, but the isolated interior built a defiant, resilient cultural identity on the back of this foreign import. The chili had completely localized, erasing its American origins to become an undisputed pillar of Chinese heritage. Roughly a quarter to a third of the world's population, upwards of 2 billion people, eats chili peppers every single day. India, a subcontinent that spent millennia perfecting the cultivation and trade of native black and long peppers, is now the world's undisputed largest producer and consumer of the American capsicum. The geographical divide in how this fruit was adopted is staggering. In countries like Mexico or Korea, daily intake hits about 15 grams per person. In Northern European countries, it barely registers at less than a single gram. And the momentum is only accelerating. Global consumption of dried chilies more than doubled between 1991 and 2001 alone. This is the footprint of a biological explosion that completely rewired the global palate, moving so fast that it outpaced the written records of the people eating it. The broader geopolitical intent of the European maritime expansion was singular and obsessive. Control the Old World spice trade. The Portuguese built a sprawling network of coastal fortresses. The Spanish launched massive Pacific galleons, and the Dutch later formed ruthless state-sponsored corporate monopolies. All of this capital, timber, and blood was expended to squeeze a few more tons of black pepper, cloves, and nutmeg out of the Asian markets and funnel them back to Europe. They locked down the Malabar coast, heavily militarized the Strait of Malacca, and waged wars over tiny islands in the Indonesian archipelago. Yet the most enduring culinary legacy of the Columbian Exchange was a chaotic accident that actively undermined those very imperial goals. By introducing the chili into the existing Afro-Eurasian trade networks, European empires unintentionally handed local populations a tool of culinary liberation. They provided a cheap, highly productive, and off-grid source of heat that required no middleman, no armed maritime shipping, and no silver bullion. The world's most fiercely guarded spice monopolies were bypassed by a hardy weed that anyone could grow in a discarded clay pot or a backyard plot. Black pepper remained a high-status luxury commodity for European export, but in the domestic kitchens of South, Southeast, and East Asia, it was thoroughly dethroned. The moment the chili took root in the coastal sands of Goa and the terraced hills of Sichuan, the era of absolute centralized control over global pungency was over. When Christopher Columbus returned to Spain in the spring of 1493, he was a man under immense pressure to deliver a return on investment. He had not found a western route to the Indian Ocean, and he certainly had not found the source of Piper nigrum. To salvage his expedition and appease his royal investors, he executed a desperate economic rebranding. He presented the fiery American capsicum to the Spanish court, where it became known as a pepper, Pimiento. Spain initially treated the plant as a low-status novelty and a mere botanical curiosity, completely missing its potential as a weapon of mass economic disruption. They failed to monetize it, leaving the Portuguese and local Asian merchants to realize its true logistical value. But over the next 5 centuries, that initial misnomer became a literal reality. Columbus's cheap, weed-like substitute successfully replaced true pepper across half the globe, functionally erasing centuries of culinary history in India, Thailand, and China. Today, billions of people fiercely defend the chili as their indigenous birthright, the ancient, untouchable bedrock of their national cuisines. What we fiercely protect as ancient tradition is often just the lingering result of a 16th-century supply chain disruption.